Focus our lens on the growing troubles currently facing Minnesota's embattled Governor Tim Walz, and which are now rapidly spreading throughout his entire state, spreading like an out-of-control fungus. A scathing new letter aimed at Walz and his cronies, a group of 98 mayors from all over the state. They're warning that fraud, out-of-control spending, and the governor's poor fiscal management are now trickling down to their cities and significantly threatening their way of life. Good job there, Tim. The group says the cash drain owing to the combination of all those factors is severely affecting their current ability to maintain their crumbling infrastructure, hold on to critical employees, and merely sustain the basic core services which are desperately needed by the folks that live there. They also say that due to what's going on, they're now facing a drastic reduction in local investment combined with much higher operating costs, and this is all resulting in a growing number of families choosing to bail out while they still can and simply abandon Minnesota altogether. I get it. I looked at a map, head west over to the Dakotas. They say it's pretty good living. Kind of cold, but pretty good living. Meanwhile, Republican state lawmakers are pointing the finger directly at Governor Walz and blaming his Democratic policies for the problem. And they say despite all of his long-winded promises, the governor hasn't made life more affordable at all. And that in reality, he's just kind of passing the buck to local governments and forcing them to raise taxes simply to stay afloat. In the letter, the mayors point out that Walz's fiscal policies have turned an $18 billion state surplus into an estimated $3 billion deficit over the next 4 years. In my mind, that's just criminal. It's dumb. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. By now, you know the backstory regarding all the financial improprieties going on in Minnesota. Billions of dollars worth of fraud means that a bunch of folks have gotten rich. Many have been caught and are serving time in the joint. Others, they're being investigated. And that Governor Tim Walz fella, being the brilliant state leader that he is, has claimed more than once that while the fraud was occurring, he knew absolutely nothing. We've all been sucker punched, and our taxes have been misappropriated to fund the lifestyles of a bunch of individuals with absolutely no conscience. While we all want our voices heard and our money back, it's clearly going to be an enormous uphill battle. But we're off to somewhat of a good start with dozens of city leaders up and down the state voicing their concerns. Now, look, concern is nifty and all, and it might even score some of those mayors another term in office. But they should be doing a lot more. Those mayors and their constituents should be creating a massive online petition demanding that the chief executive officer of Minnesota, Tim Walz, immediately be replaced, and all in an effort to get that state back on the straight and narrow. Turn our attention now to Washington, where officials and lawmakers alike now doing all they can to control the fraud damage in Minnesota from spreading even further. We can't have that. And taking extreme measures, all to ensure that nothing similar ever happens again anywhere in the U.S. How can that happen again? I think all the money's already gone. On Capitol Hill, one lawmaker introducing a new bill called the Walz Act, which aims to protect taxpayer money from being used improperly at our nation's Department of Health and Human Services. The measure stands for Welfare, Abuse, and Laundering Zillions Act. I like that. And it would require the Health Department's Inspector General to open an investigation into any programs whose total payments increase by more than 10% in any 6-month period during a single year. Yeah, basic junk. You sit there and you watch for red flags. That's part of the job. The lawmaker says she named her bill after the Minnesota governor because Walz showed a jaw-dropping failure of leadership, and that the measure puts hard safeguards in place to make sure his level of negligence can never be repeated anywhere else, not just in Minnesota, but nationwide, all across the country. Meanwhile, it just keeps getting worse for the former vice presidential candidate. Now, the Federal Small Business Administration, the SBA, has just sent a letter to Walz informing him that due to his inability to safeguard taxpayer dollars, they're calling a halt to nearly $6 million in annual support, which they've been sending to Minnesota, and that's in order to help struggling mom and pop enterprises get by. The hits just keep on coming. And final thought, this is the News Roundup Lowdown. The great leaders in our country, mayors, governors, even presidents, always say the buck stops here. Harry S. Truman, very famous for that saying. Now, perhaps Tim Walz, among other things, is not one of our country's great leaders because time and again, he claimed no knowledge of what was happening while he was the gatekeeper of the Minnesota three-ring circus of fraud, corruption, and scandal. I think Barnum and Bailey would have been impressed by this guy's circus. Yeah, it was that big. It was that good. On the other hand, as we just discussed, you've got literally dozens and dozens of mayors in Minnesota standing up, speaking out, making clear that the state's fiscal policies are damaging their cities and the fine citizens who live and work there and go to school there. Now, because Terrific Tim has generated so much conflict, it's a Republican congresswoman from Iowa to the rescue, and she's also a doctor, by the way, and her RX is called the Walz Act, a fine prescription indeed, 20 milligrams a day, 3 times a day. Safeguards should have already been in place, and that things have become so corrupt that a lawmaker from another state had to step in and clean up his mess. Well, that should be embarrassing and humiliating to Tim Walz, but that's most likely way over his head. In other words, he just got schooled. Minnesota, you are right now saddled with a lame duck leader who's governing with training wheels. And the longer he loiters around in the governor's mansion, the longer it's going to take for your state to finally bounce back.